Hi, welcome to tonight's LRA Show. Tonight we are going to be discussing the contributions of content knowledge and strategic processing to reading comprehension. This conversation was started at the LRA conference with the research review, and the panel has been kind enough to join us back tonight to talk a little bit more about their discussion. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to the panel. Anne-Marie?
All right. Thank you so much, Christy. Thanks for organizing us and making this possible, and thanks to Ian, too, for his help. So we're delighted to have this opportunity. Janice Almazy brought this group together, as Christy just said, for LRA. And one of the questions that I think she was interested in understanding is, how is it, like in an article that I had written with a doctoral student, Christine Schutz, we asked the question, how is it that strategy instruction became the nemesis of comprehension instruction? And I know my interest in that piece grew out of some personal concerns that I've had. Sometimes I've wondered if more harm than good has been done in the name of reciprocal teaching because of how it's been enacted in certain contexts. So Janice brought together Maren Ackerman, Rachel Brown, Queermoktari, and Sheila Valencia. And we started the conversation there, and we had wonderful participation from members of the audience. And so tonight we're going to try to continue on from where we were, and we're going to start by asking each of the panelists to say a bit about their relationship to comprehension instruction and comprehension research. Maren, would you start?
Sure. So I'm Maren Ackerman. I'm a professor at Stanford University. I've been thinking about comprehension, I think, since I was a bilingual teacher in Phoenix, Arizona, many years ago. And I think the big question that sort of kept coming back to me is, how does one really honor and respect what children bring and who they are in the context of teaching comprehension? How does one approach comprehension in a way that does not treat kids who might not be getting exactly what we want them to, where we want them to be in terms of an understanding? How do we treat them in a way that honors and respects what they are doing with texts?
Thank you.
I'll pass it on to the next person.
Rachel, do you want to pick up from there?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Rachel Brown, and I'm an associate professor at the Reading Arts Language Center at Syracuse University. There I coordinate the Literacy Masters program, and I also support our undergraduate inclusive elementary and childhood ed program. My research interests include self-regulated learning, digital literacy practices, a new interest in Holocaust education, and of course reading comprehension instruction with a particular emphasis on a strategies intervention known as transactional strategies instruction. The name transactional strategies instruction was given to the approach, I bet you can guess, because there's strategies at the core of it. But in addition to that, it's this kind of instruction is nested in high-quality dialogue. And so students are supposed to use the strategies to construct interpretations of challenging texts that they're reading. And one of the aspects of this particular approach is that it was a university-school partnership where we tried to take current evidence-based findings in comprehension research and then bring it into the classroom. One of the things, though, that has continued to, I don't want to say haunt necessarily, but cause difficulties is the fact that strategies instruction of this type, which attempts to also involve building prior knowledge and motivating students and building their metacognition as well, in the context of small group discussions, has turned out to be very, very difficult for teachers to do. So that's by way of a short introduction that probably could go on for much longer, but we'll just leave it right there.
Thank you, Rachel.
Sure.
Hi, everybody. My name is Queermoktari. I'm a professor at the University of Texas at Tyler. I teach literacy courses. I work with pre-service teachers and with in-service teachers as well. My interest in reading comprehension goes a long ways. I can think of my days when I was a student. Especially in middle and high school, and then when I went to graduate school, and then of course when I became a professor. But my the time that I remember when I really developed a lot of interest in reading comprehension, and I'm interested in reading comprehension processes across languages. I read in Arabic and I read in French, and of course I read in English. And so I'm always intrigued about the kinds of things that happen when you read in one language and then you transfer into another language. And I find myself sometimes doing some interesting things, borrowing from one language and using it in the other language, that kind of thing. It's kind of a fascinating kind of situation. But my strongest interest in reading comprehension became really strong in about 2000. I had actually developed at the time in 1999, 2000, 2001, tried to do something that I now think it was very difficult, very complex to do, which is to develop an instrument that measures metacognition and reading comprehension. And I called it MARCI, Metacognitive Awareness of Reading Strategies Inventory. I didn't know how complex it was until I got into it. And I got a lot of help from the late Michael Presley at the time. He helped me quite a bit with determining what are some of the strategies that skilled readers use and what needs to be included in this particular measure, that kind of thing. So I ended up publishing this instrument in the Journal of Ed Psych in 2002. And since then, it's been a tremendous learning experience with that. So, and I'm in a position where I have the privilege of working with kids who have difficulties understanding what they read, but they can read. They can have good decoding skills and generally good fluency skills, but they have difficulties understanding what they read. And that's really kind of been my focus for the past 15, 20 years.
Thank you, Peter.
Certainly.
Sheila?
Hi there, I'm Sheila Valencia at the University of Washington. I'm a professor of language, literacy, and culture. My interest in comprehension actually grows out of two projects that I've been working on recently. And one has to do with secondary school students' understanding of disciplinary reading material. And it became apparent in this project a few years into it that students, as Queeter referred to, obviously don't have difficulty with decoding, but they had quite a bit of difficulty with comprehension. And what we discovered was that it wasn't a very simple fix to help them with comprehension, that what was playing a part were multiple variables, multiple factors that were shaping their incoming background knowledge, the strategies they chose to use, the purposes that they were reading, and ultimately they were choosing not to read. So we became interested in just the complex interaction of factors that play out as students try to make sense of text. And that overlapped with our interest in what makes text complex for students. That is, not only the text itself, but how people had come to over-rely on text features at the expense of other features. So those two came together to produce a highly interactive, very complex mix of factors that we needed to deal with in both those projects.
Thank you. So we are very eager to hear what participants' questions and comments and additional observations that you've made as you've either tried to support teachers to engage in comprehension instruction or have conducted your own scholarship looking at the relationship between prior knowledge and self-regulation or strategic activity or metacognition. So please interject at any time. Christy, are you going to do you mediate that for us?
If you would like, or if you would like to, however that would work, it's fine.
So will people make an entry, a written entry, or can
Yeah.
they? Okay.
If there are any questions from the audience, I will let you know, and we'll ask those for them.
Okay, great. Thank you. So there are so many ways that we could go. People have been talking about issues about the complexity of strategy instruction, talking about the role that other reading skills play, the role of prior knowledge, the role of teacher sensitivity to children and their thinking and their just their disposition as sense makers. So we could take this many ways. One way that the panel had thought about proceeding was to talk about with the kinds of access that children have now to the internet. What role might that play with respect to how we think about strategy instruction? What does strategy instruction for the 21st century look like? Is there a way in which we can think about the work that we do in comprehension instruction is helping students, leaders to become aware of when they're confronting some kind of knowledge gap, and how is it that they can be supported to try to redress that so that it doesn't impair their continuing to build knowledge with text. And so I'm wondering if anyone would like to speak to that.
I'd be happy to get it started, Anne-Marie, if that's okay.
Please.
In the essay that I contributed, I ended up with posing a question that relates to this particular issue in particular, which I had read this study that was done by Julie Coiro, and it was published in 2011. The study, I think it's called Predicting Reading Comprehension on the Internet, Contributions of Online Reading Skills, Online Reading, and Prior Knowledge. And in this particular study, I think what the main finding, it's a pretty complicated study, but it really intrigued me, got my attention. And it apparently, they found that prior knowledge may contribute less to online research and reading comprehension than offline reading comprehension, because readers may in fact gather the required prior knowledge online as part of, you know, the reading paths that they follow when they read online. And so this really got my attention, and so prior to that I was thinking, sure, prior knowledge, it plays a significant role if you're reading something and you have difficulty, and if you don't know enough about the topic, or it's going to be a little bit challenging for you to understand what you read than if you did know a lot about the topic. So this particular study, the Coiro study, to me is inconsistent with quite a large body of evidence, both theory and research and practice. So I wanted to just kind of throw that out. I don't know if you guys have any opinion on that one or not.
I'm happy to go next and add on to Quita's comments. I'm also very, very much interested in digital literacies, and obviously reading online would be one of those areas, and how it impacts comprehension and its instruction. But on the one hand, I've been thinking about how wonderful it would be if you had the internet to help build prior knowledge before students start to read something. That seems, and it would be easily accessible. But as much as I'm thinking about the benefits, I'm also a little worried about the challenges that all the online reading comprehension tasks will bring, in the sense that, for one, if you put links into documents where children don't know a word, or where you add a piece of video or something to increase their understanding of what they're reading in terms of providing extra prior knowledge, that may have detrimental impact on their cognitive load as they're trying to process the information, because as they're attempting to understand the text, then it's drawing them away to put some of their attention on other material. And by doing so, even just the processing time of shifting from one place to another may cause problems. So I'm worried about cognitive load issues, especially for poor readers, and that by attempting to link to prior knowledge to inform what they're reading, they actually may end up hurting themselves. And also in their wanderings and linking from one topic to another, I'm afraid of the old-fashioned seductive reading effect, where they'll find something very, very interesting and keep on going and keep on going and keep on going, and may not actually return to the original text that they were reading. So that's what I have to say.
Someone who has experienced that effect myself. Other results? Yeah. Go ahead, Maren, please.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think one of the things that's really exciting about reading online, and I suspect one of the things that that might account for some of the findings that Quita was talking about earlier, is that kids have actually a fair amount of agency and can make some choices around what they're doing with text. And so they have some agency around saying, okay, this is something that I would like to find out more about, and so I'm going to go click, find out some more information about this. And so I think that there's a lot of promise. At the same time, I do think that that there is evidence that kids often read when they encounter texts online. There is a tendency to wander. There is a tendency to go different places. So if sort of I think a lot depends on what one's instructional aim is. If your instructional aim is sort of to keep things tightly reined to a particular text, then it might end up actually backfiring. But if your goal is to sort of support students as agentive readers, and in some sense to sort of let go a little bit of the control of what kind of meaning they are making, because they are then making decisions about, this is an area where I'd like to find out more, and maybe this other thing that I don't know a lot about, I'm not that interested in, so I'm not going to click to find out about that. If you're okay with that, then that actually may sort of develop a sense of reading in students that is more agentive across time. Mm-hmm. But I think it's a really important and interesting area to continue to think about and explore. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Can I add a comment to Rachel and Maren's? Just quickly, I think absolutely right. The cognitive load issue that Rachel talked about is real. And the notion that when readers read online, they get involved with so many things, and they may have a tendency to be connected but distracted, so to speak. And that, of course, has implications for what you get out of what you read. To me, this area of research is absolutely fascinating. The snag for me is that we really don't know enough. This is so new. We need to dig deeper into this. We need to examine these issues more closely. I'd love for Julie to do more work in this area so that we can learn more about whether knowledge really makes or doesn't make any difference in these so-called online reading environments.
May I add one more piece? That piece is that this is anecdotal data from the high school study. We've noticed that the nature of the reading, the nature of the texts online, and the nature of the texts in textbooks or other primary documents is actually quite different. So in general, by looking at U.S. history classes and environmental science classes and physics classes, the online material that students read is typically shorter, more focused. Of course, they have more agency when they're in there looking. So the nature of the task that they're about, the nature of the text, the nature of the way they approach the work, the strategies they use, and what's expected seem, at least anecdotally to us, to be quite different, at least in high school disciplinary classes.
I've been struck too by some of the work on project-based learning and thinking about, so when readers are playing a greater role, so there's some kind of a compelling question or interest that students are pursuing. They have access to a broader range of resources, and that's typically thanks to the internet. But they also have more of an investment. I'm very interested in the ways in which students are assuming greater agency and engaging in the kind of strategic activity that's driven by the things that they care about. And of course, the trade-off there, and so I think this speaks to the issue that Sheila is raising about the task, the nature of the task, the variation in choice that students can make with respect to the text. But of course, what teachers have to be mindful of are the conceptual goals. What is the knowledge building that the students are engaging in? But I think that's another very exciting line of inquiry to follow, is how do we see that the task begins to play a more prominent role in itself, scaffolding the efforts of the reader to engage in productive comprehension activity. Because they care deeply to advance their own understanding or a claim that they wish to make about a phenomenon or problem or issue. We do have a question from a participant in our session here, so would this be an all right time to switch off to this question?
Sure.
It actually, Sheila, picks up on a topic that you introduced. This question comes from Catherine, and she's particularly interested in our speaking to the issue of how to help future candidates learn about disciplinary literacy and its classroom applications across subjects. What I remember very clearly is that you get what you teach, and any of the comprehension instruction work that I've done, I've always felt like it was really important if I want students to have the experience of learning how to learn from historical text, then by golly, that's what they ought to be reading and talking about, and the same with science or mathematics or literature. But I'm sure, Sheila, that you have a more sophisticated answer to that question.
Well, our experience is consistent with that, of course, Anne-Marie. And one of the most challenging pieces, I think, for teachers is determining what are the most important concepts, ideas that you would like students to learn or build from text. And I think that question is actually not as easy as it sounds. Mm-hmm. It's a very challenging question, and it's particularly challenging when the texts that students are using are not always very well aligned with the goals that teachers have for deep, rigorous learning. And so when I think about disciplinary literacy, I don't think about the content strategy war. I mean, I'm not there. I'm at kind of in the camp of most of our panelists, I think, in thinking about how do we promote active processing of text, discussion, inquiry around text that allows students to both build knowledge and use the strategies they need to achieve those goals. But to do that, I think teachers have to play a major part in determining how to orient students to the kinds of conceptual learnings that they would like students to grapple with.
Yeah, so I think that with disciplinary literacy, there's sort of two different ways to think about it. One is to think about disciplinary literacy as there's a club. My students are not part of this club, and I have to get my kids to be part of this club. And when one approaches disciplinary literacy that way, one ends up excluding a lot of kids for whom there is not simply there's not necessarily an authentic sense of purpose around reading a particular way, because it does not match what kids are already doing and thinking about. Another way of thinking about disciplinary literacy is to think about it in terms of we are all exploring and thinking about text in different kinds of ways. What would it be like to try on how a historian reads text? What would it be like to try on this? How might your reading look a little different if we did this? Maybe it would, maybe it wouldn't. How did that feel? So it becomes a matter of not sort of saying what you're doing is unsophisticated, improper reading for a history classroom or for a mathematics classroom or for a science classroom, but what would be the benefits? What are some of the things that you can do in terms of thinking about that? So I do teach a secondary literacy class for content area teachers, and it's sort of the second approach that I think we aim to foster in this classroom, because I think there's so much that one can do as one is engaging students, saying, you know, what do you see? You know, what do you see here? Why did this person, you know, what would be different if you looked at it, if you looked at the text in this way? You know what, here's a historian's reading of this text. What did they do? What do you think they did? Why did they do that? And then eliciting and engaging with what students are saying. So I think that the key thing, as I see it in terms of disciplinary literacy, is introducing it as something, as an invitation to students, where students can say, yes, this is something exciting that I want to become a part of and to think more about, and that there's some real authentic reasons for me to do this, versus sort of making it a gate or something that people have to get past or get through in order to be legitimately a part of a classroom conversation. So I think the key thing in terms of disciplinary literacy for me is, how do you keep honoring students who maybe aren't doing that disciplinary literacy, quote unquote, right, within that context, in a way that continues to invite them to think about it in different ways, but also honors what they're doing in that moment.
I'll add a comment, if I may. Here at UT Tyler, we recently redesigned a master's degree program that prepares reading specialists to teach reading and to address reading issues in schools and so forth. And we have a course that we have had some debates about, and now we call it disciplinary literacy as opposed to content area literacy. And we've had some really interesting dialogue about the issue, and we see a difference between sort of one school of thought, the content area reading, versus disciplinary literacy. And one of the major differences that we see is that when thinking about disciplinary literacy, we have a couple of things in mind. One of them Sheila talked about, and that is the notion, how do we promote active processing of information, of text? And the point that Maren just talked about, how do we create this sense, this authentic sense of purpose in the classroom? So one of the differences that we see when we think about disciplinary literacy is that, imagine if you have a classroom where instead of having a teacher of science or social studies or some other content area bring in strategies and try to integrate them across her or his discipline, one view of the world, as opposed to the other view of the world, which is the science teacher begins to think about how to get his or her students engaged actively in making sense of text, by simply doing one thing, which is, if I'm a science teacher, I'm going to show my students how I, as a scientist, reads texts, creates text, asks questions about text. So I'm going to think like a scientist. So if we can begin to think about literacy in that sense across these disciplines, I really think the teaching of reading comprehension begins to look and feel very different.
And I think what Queeter is saying is that it is incredibly important as a first start, but then to move students into some kind of inquiry-based learning where they identify a particular problem to solve or a particular science or social or history project that's intriguing and that becomes real enough to them that they want to adopt or assume the mantle of scientists, of historians, and to actually practice the craft the way other practitioners in that community read, write, communicate with each other to solve problems. So I think, again, that gets back to what I heard Sheila talking about, in that the task, matching tasks appropriately to your goals becomes incredibly important. And so you want to have authentic tasks, obviously, that kids can buy into and find purpose for. But in addition, they realize that in order to be successful at those tasks, which are interesting to them, they need tools to help them get there. And instead of necessarily creating their own tools, they can learn from experts, if you want to call them, the practitioners in the field who are more experienced, who can model for them the kind of thinking, the kind of ways of speaking, the kind of ways of writing and engaging with text. And I think if it's done in a way that we're not just pretending, but we are producing something that will have value to our community, and whether it's the local community, whether it's the grade, whether it's the school, whether it's the parents, I think that then trying on being a scientist, what that means, can be incredibly motivating and can draw, and that you simply communicate to the students, you absolutely need to have these tools in order to accomplish your important goals. And the important goals being the ones that are associated with working in a discipline.
I think, too, that the text that one chooses, and I want to touch base with Catherine and see if we're being responsive to her question. I'm very aware of Sheila's point about the very abbreviated text that at least the measures of effective teaching suggest that large numbers of teachers are, for whatever reason, are using abbreviated pieces of text. And of course, those aren't going to be sufficiently rich to give readers a good introduction to, I mean, all of these, the doing of science, the doing of history, all of this is a very human enterprise. And bringing the reader behind the scenes to the fact that scientists don't always agree, and giving them texts and opportunities to read autobiographical information about scientists who, in fact, really had to enter the fray to work through one set of arguments or explanations for a phenomenon that other camps didn't agree. I think that bringing the disciplines to life through our text choices might be helpful as well, but it takes some real skill, I think, to introduce teachers to what are the sources of those texts, and how do you develop a critical eye for what's going to provide that kind of opportunity for readers. Hold on just a second. Let me see that. Okay, I think we might have responded to Catherine.
So I wanted to just add in one more thing as I'm hearing other people talk. And I think one other dimension, I think, to disciplinary literacy is that in every discipline, I think, one dimension of what actually happens when people are talking about the discipline is that there's a fair amount of disagreement, and there are differences of opinion. And so when I talk with secondary teachers, one of the things that I really encourage them to do is to allow disagreement to be a fundamental part of that learning experience and that learning process. Because if students have the opportunity to have the sense, oh, well, he sees it really differently, but I see it this way, and that's okay, that also develops the opportunity for students to think about, well, you know what, within this discipline, this kind of an argument might end up carrying more weight. This one maybe not as much. So part of what one learns through exploring disagreement is what kinds of arguments end up giving you more purchase in a particular conversation. And so I always encourage people, encourage teachers to say, give your kids a lot of space, even if you think, whoa, this interpretation is way off, or oh, this student is really not approaching this in a quote unquote as a scientist. You know what? Let's see where that goes. Let's see how other students respond, rather than sort of setting the expectation up front. Oh, well, we have to have everybody thinking about it this way, because the moment you do that, you actually end up short-circuiting the kind of fruitful disagreement that, in fact, I think can propel students into thinking, wow, you know what? When someone is making a historical argument and they're actually looking at when this piece was written, that actually gives them a little bit more credibility than if they're just sort of talking as if this piece was written yesterday. And so it becomes, again, an authentic reason to adopt particular kinds of disciplinary ways of engaging with text.
And I think it's complicated by access to resources that are in schools. So history is a favorite topic in this area, and they have access to many primary documents that become really lovely, rich moments for deliberation. And yet, in my work in schools, other than history classes, there are very limited resources. We work in schools with no access even to the internet, textbooks that are quite old, and to try to get that way of thinking around some texts is more difficult than around other kinds of texts.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Although I will add that I have seen conversations about even the most boring of science texts go in really exciting directions when again, like, actually what makes it interesting is when you have two students looking at a text and they're seeing something completely different. So I do think that certainly there are a lot of texts that are easier to dig in and have conversations with. But I also wouldn't want someone to walk away saying, well, you know what, I have a science textbook. It doesn't lend itself to that. You know what, even with a science textbook and even with an old science textbook, you've got kids who are looking at this who are probably interpreting it in different ways. Let's find out about those different ways that they're interpreting it, and let's hear what they have to say, and then let's hear why they're thinking that, and then let's proceed. So I think
Good point.
I think that that is not in any way to say we don't need better text, because we obviously do, and it makes it, I think, especially for novice teachers, it's a huge burden to say, here's some texts that are clearly not written in a very accessible or interesting way. Now go have great conversations with your kids about these texts. But I do think that I think that even with texts that are imperfect, one can do a lot more oftentimes than we initially might think.
Agreed.
Your comment, Maren, makes me think about something I've been thinking a lot about recently in my teacher education work, which is how do I encourage my prospective teachers to bring an orientation to teaching that it's all about encouraging and promoting and being curious about student sense-making. And I increasingly am wondering if that's not core to becoming a good teacher of reading comprehension, that you just have a genuine interest in how are my students making sense of this text? How are they making sense of the world? And assume that they are engaging in sense-making activity rather than assuming that, oh, they don't seem to be self-regulating or they don't seem to have a good array of cognitive strategies or however else we might want to capture that. And I'm wondering if you've had similar experiences or what role you think that orientation to teaching, that teaching is about encouraging, promoting, being curious about our students' sense-making. Is that a question? I'm hoping it is.
I think it is. I definitely think it is. When you're talking about sense-making, what sprang into my mind was the old theories about Gestalt, and that as the educational psychologist always used to study, the notion that we all want to take parts and put them together and make sense of them, because otherwise they remain puzzles. And so whether I'm seeing an image or I'm watching a dance or I'm reading a text, I want to, and I have part of it, I want to see the end. I want to see how everything goes together, fits together, and makes coherent sense. And I think that we're just creatures who are curious, and it's somehow genetically wired in us that we like to complete things, which is maybe why we don't like cliffhangers when we watch them, or soap operas or whatever like that. So the thing is, I do think that at the core, following a sense-making approach, whether you do it with the teaching students to apply a sense-making approach, that even though you're using all the strategies, the most important thing that you should always be doing is asking yourself all the time, does this make sense? And that's at the core. And for me, then there are also implications for teachers in terms of every instructional decision that they're making for their students before they introduce it to them. They should be also reflectively anticipating. Can you reflectively anticipate? To reflectively anticipate that they need to make decisions that make sense in terms of the overall picture of their students' learning. Because if you don't do that, then what you end up getting is lots of piecemeal instruction. And you start seeing, we'll spend a little bit of time on this, and a little bit of time on that, and a little bit of this and this. And the pulling together never happens. And in terms of prior knowledge, we also know that it's when you chunk like information together, then you have a greater chance of storing things in memory. And if you're not working at the bottom, you know, to make sure that everything falls into place in terms of sense, then I think we're doing our students as well as ourselves injustices. So.
A follow-up note to that, if I might. Rachel, when you're done.
I'm done.
You know, as I'm listening, I'm thinking about my own experience working with schools here where I am. I'm working with about 60 kids here, about 4 days a week, where we are trying to engage them in text in ways that would help develop academic vocabulary, develop their ability to understand text, etc. And I do a lot of observations as well of teachers. And one of the things that I think can and perhaps should happen if we are to indeed do something significant about promoting sense-making is to tweak a little bit of the role of the teacher and the role of the student. And typically what I see often, and this is really kind of an interesting thing, students somehow, and I'm referring here to middle school, they have developed dependency on the teacher. Here I am, and they're going to sit there, and you can watch it. This is the moment you walk into a classroom. They're waiting for the teacher to give orders, to give direction, to give guidance, etc. So they're not really prepared to sort of develop a little bit of dependency on themselves so that they can begin to ask questions. They can begin to think for themselves without completely relying on the teacher. And this is something to me it's always been a puzzle. It's always been a little bit of a mystery. And one of the things that I notice a lot of the time as well is the tendency of teachers to literally almost talk too much. They don't have enough opportunities for students to engage and to discuss and so forth. And so, to me, it's a question of, it may not have much to do with reading comprehension per se, but it has to do with almost like a role reversal, the student role versus the teacher role.
Yeah, and I think...
No, go ahead.
I was going to say that leads right into you. So that's exactly what I was going to say. I was going to say, Aaron will talk to us now about that topic.
Yeah. I mean, I think that when I see classrooms where I really see kids digging into text, frequently the teacher is really curious about what kids have to say, and that shows. And this gets back to Anne-Marie's original question. When I'm in a conversation with people and I have the sense that they're not really listening, I have a lot less to say. I don't really have a reason to say. Or if I'm just basically trying to get inside the teacher's head and say what I think the teacher wants to hear, and by middle school, kids are there, right? If they've had 5 or 6 years of instruction where getting the right answer was what mattered, that's where they're going to be very, very frequently. And so if you have a situation in which students have teachers where, I talked with this one teacher who when he comes out of his classroom, he is just so excited about kids' ideas. He is genuinely you can just see him. So it's not that he's sort of sitting in the classroom, prompting the kids to talk because it's a good strategy, right? He wants to hear what the kids have to say because he thinks it's interesting. And yes, I think that is fundamental to having a conversation in which kids' understandings really get illuminated and really are made to matter. And whether that's something that one can foster in teachers, I think that fostering that requires trusting kids. And so I think a lot of the work that I do with teachers has to do with encouraging teachers to take a leap of faith, to say, I'm going to listen here. And I think for some that's easier than for others. But I do think that if one can take the leap of faith of saying, you know what, maybe there's something here that I hadn't considered. Well, how did the elves get into the shoemaker's house? Well, that isn't necessarily a key idea, but you know what? It matters to these kids, and they have some ideas about it that I've never thought about. So let's talk about it. Let's think about it. Let's think about whether there's anything in the text that might give us an idea about that. And taking that idea that a child raises very seriously. So I think that there's a tremendous amount that we can do to as teachers, but I think that I do think that I can think of a particular student that I had who basically said, you know what, I'm really just not interested. And she says, I can fake it, but I'm not interested. And you know what? I think the kids can tell. Ultimately speaking, they can tell. Like, is this a fake thing, or is it really something real, something that is really about student ideas? And I think that across time, I've done comparative studies where with kids who have very teacher-led instruction, very much oriented toward right answers in comprehension, versus conversations in which there's much more focus on student thinking. And the kids have a very different orientation. In the one classroom, they are talking about you know, comprehension is about ideas. Reading is about ideas. Reading in the other classroom, they will tell you it's about getting the right answer.
Yeah.
And so we are creating certain kinds of assumptions about what reading is in the ways that we approach kids around text.
I actually teach a course to, I apologize, Peter.
That's okay.
I teach a course to beginning teaching interns. They're just in their second week of their professional education, and they take this course with me called Children as Sense Makers. And I'm very curious about what role this course might play over the course of their career, that if they come in the door and immediately they're given the opportunity. So my interns go off and they interview young children about how is it that we have day and night. And they are asked to ask that question and have the children express their thinking in words and in drawing and in using modeling material. So they use Play-Doh and a flashlight to try to model their thinking about this. And I'm very excited that I think that introducing this early, at least from some of the preliminary informal data that we've gathered with our interns, that is an experience that stays with them because they're very impressed with how even if the children are scientifically inaccurate, and most children, such as kindergarten, first grade children, don't yet have a scientific understanding of the day-night cycle, but their thinking is quite coherent, and they certainly have a reason for why they think the world is the way that it is. And of course, it's incredibly entertaining to have those kinds of conversations with children. And so I'm excited about that as an important thinking about ways in which we can include those kinds of experiences in our teacher education programs. I'm mindful that we have about 9 minutes left, and so I just want to touch base and see if there are other participants who have other questions or issues that they want to drop into this conversation before going back to Peter. And I also will just take this, okay, nothing on Twitter yet. I also want to take this opportunity. Peter made reference to the fact that there's an essay that he's prepared, and so I just want to let participants know that in the next volume of the yearbook of the Literacy Research Association, there will be essays by the 4 panelists that you're hearing this evening. Peter, I'm sorry I interrupted you.
No problem. I really just a quick comment. I'm reminded, this discussion has reminded me of some really interesting work that Catherine Snow and her colleagues are doing at Harvard University with respect to discussions, having discussions in the classroom. And I think it's really intriguing work, and one of the points that I have gathered from that work is that having discussions is really one of the secret ingredients of promoting engagement, developing prior knowledge, developing academic vocabulary, etc. It almost acts like a mediator. Given, like Maren was saying, trusting kids, having a conversation, giving them the opportunity to engage in discussion, to share their own thoughts, to be a participant, to develop dependency on themselves. And so these are the kinds of things that I think are exciting, and if a classroom that would have some of these, I guess, features, characteristics, discussion, a lot of discussion, in my opinion, are probably going to be valuable for enhancing not just reading comprehension per se, but also it makes even more sense when you use in strategies to construct understanding of what you read.
I just want to tack on to that the point that Sheila was making earlier as well. I'm thinking about some of the work that Dot Nackelhone has done. That she's looked at the qualitative differences in discussion, and the kind of discussion that advances children's understanding, I believe, in her work, is the kind of discussion where there's conceptual press on the part of the teacher. And I think that can only happen when the teacher does have clarity about what is the purpose of the conversation beyond. So I know I probably sound like I'm talking out of 2 sides of my mouth here, because I'm saying, be curious about students' thinking, but I also am mindful that not all discussion is equally productive. This goes back to the work that Marty Nystrom and Adam Gamron did years ago, and Scott's more recent work, I think, is a very good reminder that the teacher does have to have some clarity about what is the knowledge building that the activity, the conversation is advancing.
Absolutely, and I don't actually think of those two things as really in conflict with each other. I mean, I really do think that if one is clear about the idea of discussion as an opportunity to develop to develop what's going on with the student and the text. I think one of the things that I sometimes see in novice discussions is that that kids are not actually asked to talk about the text. And so the teachers are saying, well, they got off topic. Well, you never actually asked them, where did you get that idea from? What is it that made you think that? So, or they'll say, well, they didn't develop their ideas. Well, when did you ask them to develop those ideas? So I think that if you have a clear purpose in mind, and you can say, yeah, I would like for them to be talking about the text, and I would like for them to be developing their ideas around this. Now, I think it's important to have realistic expectations and to realize that kids are not going to be able to do necessarily in kindergarten. If you want kids to be talking about the text, they may be talking about the pictures. And you know what? That is great. You want them to be using those pictures as evidence. And so, sometimes I'll have teachers who are teaching kindergarten and say, well, they didn't talk about the story. Of course they talked about the story, but they were talking about the pictures, which is what they have access to. And so thinking about what students have access to, what kinds of expectations are productive, and working toward those kinds of things, and thinking, and then analyzing one's own language and thinking about, okay, what is my language here, and how does my language play into what's happening, and where do I need to tweak it? If I don't feel like my kids are going as quote-unquote deeply into the text as I'd like them to, what is it about my language that I could change to make that happen? Because there are things that one can do to make that happen.
I think that what I'm hearing hidden, or maybe not so hidden in everybody's comments, is that we have to start coming up with research methods and ways to look at comprehension as a far more complicated creature than we ever thought. Whether we're looking at comprehension from Sheila's point of view being interactive, whether you're looking at it from what I'm interested in how do you do the simultaneous or concurrent teaching of building knowledge and strategies and motivation and metacognition. You're not going to get anywhere in the old types of experimental studies where you're studying very tightly controlled, one variable at a time or two variable at a time issue. And I am wondering about how the field of research will need to move to start studying some of the more complex aspects of these different multi-componential, multi-factored parts of comprehension that all have to take place in order for such instruction to come off well. And so just calling for more research to me doesn't really answer any question that I think could really push us forward. But more, it's the kind of questions. The kinds of questions that we ask have to be more complicated, and the ways that we find for researching it and still thinking about reliability and validity and all those other issues have to become more sophisticated. And so if we don't, I think by keeping it very simple, we'll always be stuck with, oh, it's either comprehension or it's strategies instruction, or it's teacher-controlled dialogue or versus peer-controlled dialogue, or it's the text or the this or the the reader, the text, the activity, task. I think we've got to get better at looking at and examining and understanding how complex interventions work. And I'm not quite sure how to get there, but I think it's time for a nice dialogue about it.
That sounds like a great ending, I think, to our conversation. So, Christy, are you going to say thank you and goodbye?
Yes, I just want to thank you for continuing this conversation. And just a reminder to the audience that our shows are archived, and we have our show notes for more resources. And if you would like those, you can go to Twitter and use the LRA Show hashtag. And again, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedules to continue this conversation. So thank you.
Thanks.
Christy, thank you for all you've done to produce this series, this episode.
Exactly. Thank you.